Welcome to Shelf Talkers, a podcast from Village Well Books and Coffee in downtown Culver City. Hello, villagers. This is Jared from Shelf Talkers at Village Well Books and Coffee in Culver City. This is usually the time in the podcast intro where I would say something along the lines of, and I am here, of course, with my wonderful co-host and bookseller, Julia Elizabeth Evans. As we talked about during the last intro of the podcast, Julia has actually transitioned to a new position at a different company. We're super excited for her. She's working in the film industry. That's what she studied in school. We fully support this. She's still going to be involved in the podcast in different ways, but just probably not every single episode like she used to. So for this episode, at the least, this is just Jared. I'm here coming at you, talking about this upcoming episode that you're about to listen to, as well as just a little update on the store. The expansion is expanding. It's going so well, everybody. I don't know if you have seen or you've been to the store recently, but the shelves are pretty much all in place. As I'm recording this, the books are in transition, about to be completed. There's so many things going on. The store looks amazing. People can't believe the fact that it's pretty much double the size. I mean, we're going to have so many more books, so many more seating. We have a conference room that's going to be available in different ways. We have more of an office space for the office. I don't know if you've seen our tiny little office in the back of the main space, but it barely can contain one person, let alone two, let alone five, which are often trying to get different things done there. So we're so excited to have more office space and even a little staff bathroom. That's a little secret, but we are extremely excited as staff to have a dedicated staff bathroom because I don't know if you've been around to the store during peak hours, but sometimes there's quite a little line for that bathroom in the original part of our building. So if you've been following along, just please, we're so excited to open that up to you very soon. Potentially by the time this episode comes out, it'll be fully operational. We will, of course, have all that information out on our social media, if not before this episode releases, but very soon after. We are very excited to just continue providing the best service of coffee and books and events. I mean, we have so many readings, so many children's events, so many book launches, comedy shows, and we have a monthly comedy show. We also have a weekly comedy open mic. Totally different producers and different hosts, but both using the space in very different ways. I don't know if you have seen in our cafe, we have wonderful, beautiful new art describing our happy hour specials in different alcohol that we have that's been changed up a little bit recently. So Village Well in downtown Culver City continues to thrive, and we only thrive because of patrons like yourself, people who enjoy the store, people who enjoy books, who enjoy coffee, who enjoy community events, and of course people who enjoy a wonderful podcast about books where we talk to authors about their books and what they are reading. So I'm going to kick it over to that for now, but thank you all so much for listening to this episode 16 of Shelf Talkers. This episode's guest is the media critic and sci-fi author Lindsay Ellis. We are discussing her newest book, Apostles of Mercy, which is the third book in the sci-fi Noumena series, starting with 2020's Axiom's End. It's a first contact alien series, so think along the lines of Arrival, set in an alternate timeline, 2007, and it explores how the government, in this case the end of the Bush administration, would handle a dangerous first contact with an unknown alien species and cover it up, all through the lens of a whistleblower and a journalist. And as the humans and aliens make contact, they also make these murky relationships with each other in their attempts to save Earth and what they hold dear. The societal critiques run high, the late 2000s pop culture references at times even higher, and the book does what sci-fi can do best, show us a mirror to ourselves and force us to ask questions about which parts of human civilization are worth saving. Axiom's End, the first one in the series in 2020, became an instant New York Times bestseller. Lindsay has also built a massive following for her video essays and documentary work, both on YouTube and on Nebula.tv. As you'll hear in the interview, Julia has been a fan for quite some time, and it's fun to hear her get to ask questions from that standpoint as well. Please enjoy this wonderful interview with the impressive and prolific Lindsay Ellis. Get into it.
So this is a book about first contact.
Yes. And by this point in the series, because this is the third in the series, and by this point, the, hypothetical alien civilization is probably gonna do bad things, but they're pretty far away. We don't really know what they're going to do or what the time frame is. So basically the premise of the book is what we, as a sort of like near past alternate history culture, this book takes place in 2009. How do we react with this like impending doom that is still very nebulous but kind of very thinly veiled metaphor for climate
And you're
change.
not even talking about Dick Cheney being president.
Yeah, which was like kind of a funny joke.
That was so fun.
Love that.
Basically, like, I mean, that's interesting thinking of it as a metaphor, obviously, and like an allegory. But did you have any trepidations in writing the ethics and just writing a first contact story? I mean, it's basically a huge question for a sci-fi author, but like, what were your trepidations creating this kind of whole like legal system essentially?
Well, it's if there was a trepidation, it's being concerned that people might think that a depiction is the same as an endorsement, even when a sympathetic character may do or engage in a certain behavior or a certain belief or a certain political system. Because the further into this we get, the more it feels kind of like a dialectic in places where you'll have, characters that kind of embody maybe certain attitudes towards the way we approach, in this case, first contact, for instance, like Cora, who I guess is the main series protagonist. By the beginning of the third book, she has kind of washed her hands of humanity. She's just sort of like, you know what, I know what is coming. And I also don't think that this civilization can be saved from itself or from these aliens. I think they are just bad news. And we are bad news. And meanwhile, you have Paris, who is a little bit more optimistic, much more of an activist, and just not the type that's going to roll over and, give up. And I think it's neither of these characters necessarily are how I feel on any given day. I think, sometimes I can go one way or the other. But I think, that's sort of the fun thing about writing a book like this that is so close to our culture, is it kind of gives me, like, as a writer, the opportunity to, like, kind of work through these thoughts and feelings that are like, I joke that it's a thinly veiled metaphor for climate change, but that is something I have a lot of anxiety about. And, there are some days when I'm just like, why bother?
Right.
Just like, I'm just gonna, F you got mine and just live in my little house in Long Beach, and hopefully we don't, see the ocean rise too much in our lifetime.
Right. Well, like reading this, I read Axiom's End a while back, right, when it first came out. But, finding Cora and reading her journey, or essentially where she's at mentally, politically, everything, sympathetically, it was cathartic for me because I grew up very political, and at a time climate rightness and political climate like this, it's hard to stay engaged.
Yeah. And especially when you are surrounded by just these fundamentally exhausting, for-profit news cycles that are meant to exhaust you and designed to exhaust you. Now, kind of imagine that, but it's like you are at the center of it, which is what Cora is. She is a celebrity by this point in the novel, but not the fun kind, where you have like a management team. She's like the bad kind of celebrity, like Monica Lewinsky, who's like
that's a good
thrust into like this, spotlight that she didn't ask for, and now she is like all these things to all these bunch of people. Some people like her, some people hate her, and she just doesn't want to be there. And so the sort of dialectic aspect is, I have been accused of it sounding like, dialogue in a video essay.
Between those two characters?
Or between any characters. There's a scene between Cora and her father in this where they kind of actually hash out their political viewpoints, and like someone like on Twitter was like, I'm sorry, X, was like, why is this so stilted and formal? And I was like, well, in the scene, it makes sense. But at the same time, these two characters are of, very opposing viewpoints with regard to how information is disseminated.
Well, and it's all characterization. I mean, I was going to say it's plot and characterization. She's living it. She's living these questions, right?
And in this case, this is the first time she's seen her father in 7 years, and she wants to prove to him that she is an adult and she can talk like an adult.
And I just want listeners to be aware that this is going to be a big gas up for Lindsay from Julia's POV.
Oh yeah, we haven't officially acknowledged this yet in the recording.
But Julia is a major fan of our guest Lindsay Ellis. But that's all to say that it was extremely cathartic to be in Cora's mind reading this.
It's interesting you bring that about the dialectic with the dialogue, because I feel like that's what books used to always be until we kind of had more of the pulpy action expectation of sci-fi or
that,
fantasy.
like, kind of the Joss Whedon effect where everything kind of has to feel like we're looking at the camera and we know this is fake. And I find that a little bit exhausting.
But if you read any old novel, that, especially pre-modern era, it's mostly philosophy.
Yeah, like Heinlein, that was his whole thing, was he was never...
Wait, who?
Robert Heinlein. Like he wrote Stranger in a Strange Land.
Oh yeah, sure.
The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, Starship Troopers.
Yeah.
And he's an interesting guy because like he's not one of these guys that was like a polemicist.
Yeah.
Like Joseph Campbell or even Orson Scott Card, who like they have these political beliefs that just define them. Like Heinlein was more, he liked to dabble in a different, like using science fiction to kind of like play with different political viewpoints. And like if you read some of his books, like they are somewhat in like contradiction to each other, and you'd kind of be like, how did the same guy write all this except for the way he writes women, which is just like but yes, you can see that the same guy wrote that, but like but like just from like the way he like politicizes things, his books are all pretty different, which is interesting. And I think that that was a lot more common, whereas now it seems like you are supposed to be like capital S saying something, so then you can go onto podcast and be like, yes, we need to vote for Joe Biden. Like,
sure. Or people see anything as an agenda. Right? I don't know, like the dialogue around the newest Star Wars show, The Acolyte. People call it woke, and I'm watching the show and I'm like, how could you even? It's just people fighting in space. Like you're turning this, but people don't want it to have any message when it's like that's all art used to be. Not all art used to be, but I mean, it's interesting the
art does communicate something, even if that is just upholding of the status quo.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think that like fundamentally, that's what these people are threatened by.
Right? Absolutely.
But like that's its own.
Well, I mean, now I want to acknowledge that. So one of my favorite books in the like recent books is The Dark Forest, which is. That's a good example. Well, it's not an example necessarily. Well, it is of dialectic, but of science fiction, and then the way that women are written in science fiction, right?
Yeah, and like I'm a little hesitant to criticize those books. But.
No, absolutely. Well, that's for me as a reader. I can speak, and it's not. This is not Lindsay's point. This is mine. It's to say that reading Apostles of Mercy, that's another form of catharsis. It's like, look. We can have women in these sci-fi books that are contemporary, because to a certain extent, even though it was translated.
If people don't know, The Dark Forest is the sequel to the Three-Body Problem.
Yeah, one of my favorite series of the past 20 years.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's all to say, like, so it sounds like you're like, we're not. Yeah. But are you considering that all the time as yourself? Like,
no, I feel like I do characters first, and a lot of the dialectic kind of springs from that.
Yeah,
it's because I think
points of view.
A lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people in the real world are very motivated by like their politics.
Yeah,
and when I say politics, I don't mean necessarily vote. Like, because in the case of like you have these like a lot of the main characters in the entire series are journalists,
right?
And I guess there are journalists who are just purely nonpartisan, but most journalists, like especially investigative journalists, like they are trying to figure something out. They are trying to ferret out a story. They are trying to change the world with their story, and that is a form of politics. So like all of these characters are very like driven by like like Nils, Cora's father, is very like his whole thing is radical transparency, but at the same time it's kind of hard to really believe him because he's also extremely self-serving. And then you have Kaveh, who's the second protagonist for the second book, who is an immigrant, and he's from Iran. And so his whole thing is very like, I saw what happened in Iran. I could see it happening here. I don't want it to happen here. So how can I use my platform to, push us away from like this sort of extremism that like, made Iran the way it is. And then you have Paris in the third book, who is also likewise very motivated by wanting to be an investigative journalist and put herself in the line of fire, ultimately for the greater good.
So this brings me to the question about like the series and the scope, and the kind of my last question, but I think it's relevant here. I want maybe you could started up where it's like, oh, in time where series are not really finished, but
oh yeah, I mean, because we do have such an interesting, obviously in the TV world, but even in the book world, we have so many stories that start and then don't get finished, and especially in the fantasy sci-fi world, there's so many famous examples of that right now. Did you know like all 5 books?
Yeah.
You said it's a 5-book
Yeah,
series.
I pitched 5. Like,
right?
Really?
Yeah, well, like
I've heard from publishers say that like never pitch a series, always pitch a book.
Yeah,
and so you pitched a whole series.
Yeah, we pitched a whole series. They bought one. And then,
they said, we'll see how it goes?
Yeah, and then when
but you had all 5 known.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and then when they bought 2 and 3 when the pre-order numbers for the first one came in.
Oh, nice. Amazing.
And so I still haven't sold 4 and 5, and the reason for that is because I haven't finished the proposal. Like, like some jerks that are just like, they haven't bought. Like, no, they're gonna buy it. It's just a question for how much money and also when.
Yeah.
And I have to finish the proposal, and I've just been busy, man. I just had a baby. So they make
And congratulations.
Thank you.
Exactly.
Yeah, they have a way of sucking the words right out of your brain and the hours right out of the day.
And the energy, absolutely.
Yeah.
So was it 5 in your head, and you're like, yes, immediately. This is. I know it's going to be a longer series.
Yeah. I think it's just because on a base level, I knew what the character arcs for each one were. Because like structurally, these books didn't change from outline to final product. Like at least so far, like the first 3, like some chapters got deleted and moved around. Sometimes certain like objectives got taken from one character and given to another character. There were even a couple of characters who I was gonna kill in this book, but then didn't, because I realized like, oh, I have something for them to do later.
Yeah.
But for the main, like, this is where our main characters are. This is what their relationship is. That's kind of like what I kind of built it around, where like and I knew where they were going to start and where they were going to end in each book. So that's kind of why I was just like, I knew always exactly how it was going to be, no more, no less.
Because of characterization.
Yeah, basically. Like, or like the things that happen in each book. Like this book is the thing where, these 2 characters meet, or in this book, this political situation needs to unfold so we can like, set it up for the final battle in the final book, that sort of thing.
Yeah, right on. Now, well, I'm curious about like, was all that organization, all of that structure for the storytelling and for the plot and the characterization, how much did that change, not just from fans, but like with your editor? Or was that something that you just kind of had it and you knew it was going to shape up? Like, I mean, did you have a strong editor with you? Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
My editor, he's an acquisitions guy. He's not really a developmental editor.
Yeah.
I do work with freelance editors, and I guess that's sort of my big regret with my first book, was that I didn't do that more or sooner. But yeah, like I have like a small team of freelance editors that I work with that like help me with development. But not with the publisher. No, they're just not really that kind of.
Yeah, I dig.
Not that kind of publisher. Yeah.
The reason I asked about that is because of your background in screenwriting, and like screenwriting entails so much development. And
yeah.
And I myself have been in situations where people have really strong ideas of what how the story should change, and then as a creator, you're like, no.
Yeah. I mean, I have had a few that were like, I feel very strongly that you should do this. And then I would do this and I would be like, yeah, that's a good call. I will stick with that. But then there were other times when like someone would be like, you really need to change this. And then I change it. And then I'd be like, nah, it was better the way it was before.
Yeah, right.
So I think it really just, I think part of becoming a professional writer is learning when to listen to your instincts versus to editors. Because there were a few things in the first book that like my real editor was like, you should change this. And I was like, well, I don't want to rock the boat. And so I'd do it. And then I'd kind of be like, man, I should have just.
Interesting. Yeah.
Should have just left it the way it was, but it's fine. Like.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I was going to ask him, well, Lindsay and I happen to both studied at USC, but we both studied sound. So I studied under a professor named Stephen Flick, who we learned monster sounds in his class. And he really drilled this archetype of like woman and beast. Like Godzilla, and like in the first Godzilla, and the main character is a woman, and then you have of course King Kong, so like monkey and woman, and then in this case woman and ET,
or two women and two
yeah exactly,
one of which gets directly compared to Andero at one point.
Yeah. So I wonder what you think about that, like now that your series is kind of in that canon, in that archetype. Is it something that
yeah no, that definitely, that was always kind of like at its basest element, it's sort of a combination of Beauty and the Beast and E.T. And all that implies, because I think the thing about like the sort of E.T. Subgenre, stuff like The Iron Giant, is that the boy and his ex is they're usually sort of children and or childlike, which is why it kind of works in a movie like E.T., where it's like you have Elliot and E.T. might be like 5 million years old. We don't know. But like he's got a childlikeness to him. And so there's that innocence there that whenever they kind of have their heart bond, like, yeah, there's an underlying creepiness to it. But like you kind of trust E.T. and like you feel like E.T. and Elliot get each other because they are simple in the way that children are simple.
Right.
And in this book, it's like that's where the Beauty of the Beast element kind of comes in. It's just like they are messy in the way that adults are messy, but they still kind of have that kind of the same telepathic heart bond thing that Elliot and E.T. have, only they are adults and all the baggage that entails, which is just sort of I guess my exploration of like how being in a relationship with a person that is carrying unresolved trauma around with them can bring all parties down and can cause harm to everybody involved.
Yeah. Do you see yourself then as subverting the like Beauty and Beast genre?
No, 'cause I think it's more just like most Beauty and the Beast stories that you see now, at least in fiction, tend to be romance.
Yeah.
And they tend to be self-published, which is interesting to me because it's doing very well,
That subgenre is doing very well?
Yeah, that subgenre does extremely well,
really
but you don't really see them in bookstores because they
So
tend to be
self-published.
Yeah. They tend to be self-published, but it's extremely popular. Like, ice aliens from the planet Ganar who, steal the helpless maidens, and I think it's that traditional publishers think they're too highbrow for that.
Yeah.
Because these are more like erotica.
Right.
But
They lean into that.
Yeah. And then like the ones that are actually romance, they'll be categorized under like urban fantasy, not science fiction fantasy, if that makes sense.
Sure. When you with all these references of, okay, it's like an E.T., it's like a Beauty and the Beast, or these other references you're pulling out, and you're a very reference heavy person in a way that I enjoy, in a way that I know when I'm with my friends, people are like, cool down on the references. Like, I get that.
Yeah, I get that.
That's kind of, that's a lot of LA people, but that's definitely this personality type. How do you see when you're writing like the balance between pulling from your influences and then also like charting your own path forward into that territory?
Well, I think I overdid it in the first book because I thought people would want to see lots of pop culture references from the era. And in the second and third book, it was more like, kind of almost like a chain of consciousness type thing. But then I would actually like look back, kind of Google like what was the deal like in 2009 and see if like there was a way I could write it in. Some things I didn't write in, but like I had this calendar that would tell me like, well, this is when Two Girls One Cup came out, this is when Drunk History was released, like all these things that kind of happened at the time.
Wait, did you create that calendar? Yeah, that sounds
just so I would like be able to refer to it. And there's a few things that made it in there, like I forget, like Britney Spears shaving her head happened in January 2009.
That's so sweet.
Did you include were you ever thinking like the Arab Spring or something like that?
I'm like, I guess that's one of those things like, does that happen in this universe? I don't know. That's a really good question. Like eventually, like it's just going to become way too complicated to keep track of, because if the timelines diverge in mid 2007, by 2009, there's already so much like, because I guess
the international foreign like relations landscape totally different by then.
Khashoggi, when did he get assassinated? Khashoggi, the Iranian journalist.
Khashoggi. That was more recent. Right? Yeah, that was like in 2016, 2017.
And had you already written your second? It was released.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of obvious that like Kaveh is a little bit based on Jamal Khashoggi.
No, I thought that was actually cool. I thought that was like,
because like whenever I wrote there's spoilers for the second book, because like the third book begins with like an obituary for Kaveh. And I based that on like I was actually like I sought out obituaries about Jamal Khashoggi, And a lot of them were written by his colleagues and were very political in their way. They weren't just straight obituaries. They were like, this is a guy who did this X, Y, and Z, and he believed in this, and he was murdered for it, and we need to hold the people who did this to account.
Right.
No, and that was like kind of the elegance of this. It made me feel really grounded in the place. Right, like, or like the time and setting.
Yeah.
Where like, okay, it's.
So I guess right now Jamal Khashoggi is alive in this universe, but I don't know. Maybe he will go to a different embassy that day. And
Exactly.
Or maybe
he survived.
Yeah, or maybe he's joined the journalistic enterprise of this universe.
Or maybe like there's a chain of events that leads to the royal family of Saudi Arabia getting in a tragic plane crash.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
You could.
Maybe it was alien.
I'm the god. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. You're the writer. You can
Why
do
not?
anything you want.
Yeah, exactly.
Point,
just like, wow, there's a lot of plane crashes killing world leaders lately. Is this?
At that point, it almost feels like we're in Doctor Who territory almost, of like traveling around and influencing world events.
Well, you could, because like if you notice that they live in Fukushima, and it's 2009, and people are like, wait a minute.
Shoot, I didn't even bring that. I didn't even bring that connection all the way.
Well, because they live in the mountains of Fukushima.
Okay, that's why.
So like that wouldn't be directly affected by the tsunami, but like I guess it's just like, would it be considered disrespectful if like the timeline was slightly altered, even if it was just so much as like alien interference keeps the nuclear factory from melting down.
Yeah.
Because knowing what I know about the meltdown that happened, it could have been very easy to prevent with the correct, like even like if it had happened now, it probably would have been prevented because of technology. Because basically it was a hydrogen explosion. Yeah. They just needed to get the hydrogen out.
Yeah, they just needed to get it to like a higher ground, essentially.
Yeah, it was just that was what made it go boom. Was like it was a hydrogen explosion, and then that was what made the radioactive fallout happen. And it's just like one of those things where just like a teensy little tweak of the timeline would have had led to a very different Japan.
Right.
You know, would Shinzo Abe have been elected? Would like that entire region would not have needed to be evacuated.
Was it questions like that? I mean, those kind of like timeline, because we're setting it in the real world, setting
the
it.
butterfly effect.
Yeah. How did this is a process question. I mean, was that kind of like some of the part that made it a little longer?
It's fun at first, but then whenever you like get into the nitty gritty of it, you're just like, oh man, like the things that lead to all of these, you know, little granules of timeline are so complicated that if somebody's just like, hey, well, this happens, does that mean X, Y, and Z happen? And it'll be something that I didn't even know about or didn't even take into consideration. I'll be like, I don't know. Like, it's like after a point, it's just kind of science fiction. Yeah, this is why George R. R. Martin writes in a totally fictitious universe, because then he can just be like, yeah, I know the answer to that. Totally.
Yeah, just make it up.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm like diagnosing Lindsay Ellis's brain, but I think of your mind as like kind of an expensive wristwatch. You know, everything is like perfectly tuned, and all the gears just click and click and click, and they just like
no. My mind is a knockoff Rolex that you buy in Chinatown. Like it has the veneer of like it fools you into thinking that it knows what it's doing. It really is like,
but like all the timelines are just clicking, and it's basically they just I was imagining
a lot of this stuff doesn't really matter as it pertains to the plot, right? You know, because like the plot is what it's going to be, you know, because I'll outline it and be like, you know, and
that's
then
the question that you ask yourself.
The fourth one will be like, you know, right now the outline is like they have some conflict with X world leader and it leads to Y, and the which world leader it is doesn't really matter, you know, because it's just like it could be Putin, it could be the Russian, you know, it could be the Chinese, you know, it doesn't matter which world leader does the plot thing, because that is at least, you know, how I learned at USC, like how I approach plot is like the plot is like a series of objects that need to like be put together like Lego bricks, and then you paint the bricks. And sometimes like a character's like gender or ethnicity will absolutely play into it. And in that case, I will have decided that well in advance. But even then, like the actual texture of it will kind of be filled in later, like in second and third drafts. Like when I was outlining it, it was set in like a variety of different countries that I didn't really gel until like the end of the first draft, second draft. Like when I chose Cambodia, because I think super originally it was Angola. I forget why. Because I think maybe it was because Angola was much more vast of a wilderness. Yeah. And it kind of made more sense for like the Viscerans to choose Africa because it is less deforested than Cambodia, but I chose Cambodia because it was easy for me to get to.
Sure.
But I wrote like most of the drafts before I was able to physically go there.
Yeah.
And I'm, glad I did, because that was like, it changed like the way I would write certain scenes and the way I would describe them, but I didn't really change the plot.
Yeah.
Like I
chose
it's
the painting and like
yeah. Like I chose the Philippines because I needed a country where they bury their dead.
Right.
And because like originally I set it in Thailand because I wanted to go to there.
Yeah, right on. You wanted to go there.
That was literally the only reason. It was like I wanted to go to Thailand and party.
And do research.
Yeah, and do research.
Yes.
And then I realized I couldn't set it there because they don't bury their dead in Thailand. They burn them.
Yeah.
And that's true most of Southeast Asia. Like any kind of Hindu or Buddhist country, like community anyway, obviously Muslim, they bury their dead. But like in most of Southeast Asia, they burn their dead. So I was like, well, where is near there
that's so interesting.
China? I don't want to go to China. I've been there. I don't like it.
Interesting.
Yeah,
wow.
it's like, well, it's because you have to have the visa, and
so it's
every single, like, if you are going to go to China, the extent to which everything has to be like with a tourist group and like very cultivated is just very like stifling,
especially if you are some sort of media type of person.
I've been to China. I've done the official China tour. I did not like it, but
so essentially you had the scene, right? You had the scene of like this happens, and they go and they visit.
So like I visited between like the third and fourth draft. It was in January 2009
to get the details of the Philippines done.
And cool. Cambodia, although really most of what I got in Cambodia was like, what are the cheap hotel rooms like? Because there's one scene that takes place in a cheap hotel room. And what's the jungle like?
Right.
Because like,
and that's your documentary experience as well.
Yeah. Like, although like, because I filmed a bunch of stuff while I was there, because I did that for Truth of the Divine, because most of my
the second book in the series.
Yeah, the second book, most of it took place in Southern California.
Yeah.
Because I was like, we're gonna have road trips, me and friends are gonna go to Temecula, and we're gonna go to Sequoia, and then the world closed, and I couldn't even research that much. So I thought I wasn't going to get to go, but then this book kept getting delayed, and finally I was like, well, I guess I do have time to go to Asia. Yeah.
Sadly, we probably do need to be wrapping up on time. Do you have a final question you want to ask?
Well, I was just going to kind of veer off for a moment, and ask you about your Nebula TV documentaries and all that, the research there, if that at all has a cross-reference, because,
No.
Like, so you're able, like, you're able to keep all of those stories separate?
Yeah, I find them very different. Like, I guess that's, there's definitely a compartmentalization there, but I find that the process of writing fiction and writing nonfiction is, like, super, super different.
Right, because of that idea, fiction versus nonfiction.
Yeah, well, I mean, most of my nonfiction stuff I write collaboratively. Right. So, like, we'll have, like, I use different software. Like, I'll use Google Docs for nonfiction, and we'll, like, I have, like, citations in the comments, and, just very, very different. Whereas like with fiction, it's just like you are just writing and rewriting the same thing over and over again. There's not like most of the research is textural. It's not it's not really going to influence the text, if that makes sense. Whereas
that does make sense. It's kind of like that same idea of like being honoring or like making sure that
because
like,
I think that's the thing. Like whenever I like do research or like higher sensitivity readers, I don't do it to cover my ass, because I think a lot of people think of it as just like ass covering, so I don't get yelled at on Twitter. I'm like, man, I'm going to get yelled at on Twitter either way. To me, it's about just making it feel grounded and real.
Making it better.
Just making the texture feel correct and cohesive. Because that's my big regret with the first book, was I said a lot of it in places that I could not go. Like NORAD and Langley, Virginia, like these are places that you can't go even if you want to.
Yeah.
So like these scenes feel very muddy in my head,
so
because I don't.
How they feel.
That is the difference between the first and this book. This book is extremely grounded. It's like really.
Because I feel like whenever you can actually physically go somewhere, like I know that's not important for all authors, but to me it's like super important, because I need to feel like the scene has a cohesion and a solidity to it. And if I don't know what the scene looks like, then it just doesn't. Sure. And like it's not the end of the world, but it's just not as good as it could be, which is why I kind of struggle like promoting my first book. I'm like, it's fine.
Oh yeah.
So have you felt yourself less attached to it in that sense?
Yeah,
in
it's
the
just
groundedness?
it feels. amateur, you know. It's just like I hadn't
grown
quite,
so much
I
after
hadn't
just a
figured
couple
out
of books.
my, like, you know, process yet.
Sure.
I didn't do as much research as I would do for because this was a very expensive book. Boy, let me tell you. Like, you know, just like between the research and the editors and PR, like stuff like that. Like it, you know, because like you'll be like, you know, oh, this is what you got paid. I'm like, yeah, but half of that went to
research,
the book, you know, and the other half went to taxes.
Well, that's so cool to hear that you've already feel like you've grown so much, though. I mean, that's such a cool.
It's a really steep learning curve, like for novels, definitely.
I didn't even think about that in terms of the text and how like you as an author are growing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, sadly, I think we do. This is one of those interviews that totally could have been another hour, but we sadly have to chop it here. But thank you so much for coming in, Lindsay.
No, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was a really fun time talking to you about your newest book, Apostles of Mercy, the third in the Noumena, probably is how we say it, series.
Noumena.
So come on over to Village Well, grab a copy of Apostles of Mercy or Axiom's End or whichever part of the series you want to start in. And thank you again.
I do recommend starting at the beginning.
Yes, absolutely.
Not because the book, you know, and the book is great. So the first book is fantastic. It's very, it's got great backgrounds. It's very well.
Love that. No, I was more even just thinking in terms of maybe people have already read the first or second, so they come in straight for this.
Like, I guess like the first kind of, I see that kind of like the crust of the pie, you know, it needs to be there in order for the rest of the pie to have shape.
Yeah, you don't want condiments running off the side of the pie.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
And we'll catch you in a couple weeks, everybody.
Yeah, 2 weeks from now. Thank y'all.
This episode of Shelf Talkers is brought to you by Village Well Books and Coffee. It was produced and hosted by Julia Elizabeth Evans and Jared Kassebaum and edited by Akash Timuluri, with music by Noah Vickland.